Hello everyone, hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're diving into a shocking twist. Lynn shows up at Mrs. Nghia's hospital room with a routine form that may actually be a trap to steal control. Then an edited hallway video goes viral. If you enjoy the story, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. The hospital corridor looked calm. Clean floors, soft lights, quiet footsteps. But inside Mrs. Nghia's room, the air felt tight, like something bad was about to happen. Mrs. Nghia lay on the bed, pale but awake, her IV dripping steadily. Tu Tieu sat close beside her, phone in hand, rereading the extracted messages from the burner number thread. Lynn's instructions were right there, cold, organised, impossible to deny. Still, Tu Tieu didn't feel relief. She felt a warning, because Lynn wasn't the type to quit after losing an insider. She was the type to change the battlefield again. A nurse knocked and stepped in with a clipboard. "Mrs. Nghia, we need a quick signature for your updated treatment consent," she said gently. "It's routine." Tu Tieu's eyes lifted instantly. "What is it?" The nurse smiled politely. "Just standard consent. The doctor adjusted medication and added a monitoring test." Mrs. Nghia nodded weakly. "Okay." The nurse placed the clipboard on the bed and held out a pen. Tu Tieu didn't move yet. She watched. The paper looked normal. Hospital header, boxes, lines. But Tu Tieu's instincts flared anyway, because Lynn's entire strategy was built on one thing: getting a signature when someone is tired, scared, or rushed. Tu Tieu reached out calmly. "May I read it first?" The nurse hesitated. "It's routine, but sure." Tu Tieu read every line quickly. Most of it was normal. Then she noticed something small, too small for a sick person to catch. A second page was clipped behind the first, barely visible. Tu Tieu's fingers slid the papers apart. The nurse shifted uncomfortably. "You only need to sign the first page." Tu Tieu looked up, voice calm but firm. "Then why is there a second page?" The nurse blinked. It's just a copy for records." Tu Tieu's eyes narrowed. A copy didn't need separate signature lines. She lifted the second page carefully, and her blood went cold. It wasn't a hospital form. It was a clean, professional page with legal spacing, exactly the type of layout Lynn had been using. Tu Tieu didn't react loudly. She didn't accuse the nurse. She simply lowered the clipboard and turned it slightly so Mrs. Nghia could see. Mrs. Nghia's eyes widened, confusion and fear rising. "What is that?" Tu Tieu whispered. "Don't sign anything." The nurse's face tightened. "Miss, you're misunderstanding." Before the nurse could finish, the door opened, and the temperature in the room dropped. Lynn stepped inside with a calm smile, dressed like she was walking into a business meeting, not a hospital room. "Mrs. Nghia," Lynn said softly, almost sweet. "I heard you weren't well. I came to check on you." Mrs. Nghia stared at her, trembling. "How did you—" Lynn sighed gently, as if she was the victim of worry. "People talk. When someone is sick, news spreads." Tu Tieu stood up slowly, placing herself between Lynn and the bed. "This is a hospital. Visiting hours are limited." Lynn's eyes flicked to the clipboard. "Oh, consent forms. Good. That means your care is moving forward." Tu Tieu's voice turned icy. "This isn't a consent form." The nurse looked trapped now, eyes darting between Lynn and Tu Tieu. Lynn's smile didn't change. "Tu Tieu, please, don't stress her. She needs peace." Mrs. Nghia's breathing quickened. "Lynn? What are you doing here?" Lynn walked closer, careful, measured. "I'm here to help. Your company is in chaos. Reporters are everywhere. The board is panicking." Tu Tieu cut in. "Because you made them panic." Lynn's gaze slid to her. "I didn't make anyone do anything. People simply react to the truth." Mrs. Nghia's voice shook. "I did nothing wrong." Lynn's expression softened like she was comforting a child. "I believe you, but the public doesn't, and that's the problem." She leaned slightly toward the bed. "Right now, the board is thinking about an interim spokesperson, someone stable to reassure the market." Tu Tieu's jaw clenched. Lynn was doing it, pressuring Mrs. Nghia while she was physically weak, using fear as leverage. Lynn continued, voice smooth. But there's a simple way to stop the chaos, a temporary authorization, just until you recover. No scandal, no fighting. Mrs. Nghia stared at her horrified. Authorization? For what? Lynn nodded toward the clipboard like it was nothing. Just a signature, that's all. So someone can act on your behalf while you rest. Tu Tieu stepped forward, holding the second page up. You mean this signature? Lynn's eyes flickered, just once. A micro expression of annoyance. Then her calm returned. Tu Tieu, please, put that down. You're confusing her. Tu Tieu's voice stayed steady. No, you're trying to trick her. Lynn sighed as if deeply disappointed. You're emotional. That's why people don't trust you. Then Lynn turned to the nurse, still smiling. Could you give us a moment? Family matters. The nurse hesitated. Her hands trembled slightly. Tu Tieu spoke quickly. Do not leave. This is not family. This is coercion. Lynn's smile thinned. Coercion? I'm offering help. Tu Tieu raised her phone. And I'm documenting everything. Lynn's eyes sharpened. Don't do that. Tu Tieu didn't blink. Why? Afraid of another recording? Mrs. Nghia's face drained. Another recording? Tu Tieu softened for half a second and squeezed her hand. You're safe. Don't worry. Lynn's jaw tightened. You think recordings matter? The public doesn't care about recordings, they care about headlines. Tu Tieu's voice turned cold. Then let's make the right headline. Lynn stepped closer, voice dropping, dangerous now. If you keep blocking me, I'll make sure the hospital hears that you're harassing a patient. I'll make you look unstable, just like the board already fears. Tu Tieu's eyes stayed steady. Try. Lynn turned back to Mrs. Nghia with practiced gentleness. Mrs. Nghia, you look exhausted. You shouldn't be fighting, just sign the paper and rest. Mrs. Nghia's hand lifted weakly toward the pen, not because she wanted to, but because she wanted the pressure to stop. Tu Tieu gently pulled the pen away. No. Lynn's expression cracked, anger flashing through her mask. You're interfering with medical care. Tu Tieu held up the second page again. This isn't medical care. Mrs. Nghia's voice trembled. Is that an authorization? Lynn's smile returned too quick. It's nothing dangerous, just temporary. You can revoke it later. Tu Tieu shook her head. That's a lie. Lynn leaned in, eyes cold. You want her to suffer? Fine. Keep her name in the mud. Keep the crowd screaming outside. Keep the board ready to vote her out. Mrs. Nghia flinched, tears rising. Tu Tieu spoke softly directly to Mrs. Nghia. Listen to me. If you sign, you give her control. She will never give it back. Mrs. Nghia's chest rose and fell rapidly. The monitor beeped faster. The nurse stepped forward, alarmed. Her heart rate? Tu Tieu raised a hand. Please call the doctor, now. Lynn took a slow step back, eyes narrowing like she was calculating. Then she smiled again. Calm, confident. See? Lynn said softly. Stress harms her. You're hurting her by fighting. Tu Tieu's fists clenched, but she kept her voice controlled. You came here to provoke her on purpose. Lynn didn't deny it. She simply glanced at the door as if timing mattered. And that's when Tu Tieu understood. Lynn didn't need Mrs. Nghia to sign in this moment. She needed one thing more dangerous, a scene, proof that Mrs. Proof. Nghia was unstable. Proof that Tu Tieu was aggressive. Something the board could use as an excuse. The door opened again. 2 hospital security staff stepped in. One of them said, We received a complaint about a disturbance. Lynn's eyes softened into fake concern. Thank you for coming. I'm worried. She needs rest, but someone is upsetting her. Tu Tieu's blood turned cold, because Lynn had just flipped the story inside the hospital, exactly like she flipped it outside the company, and now Tu Tieu had to win this fight without raising her voice, without touching anyone, without giving Lynn a single frame she could twist. Mrs. Nghia lay trembling on the bed, and Lynn stood smiling beside the clipboard like the pen was a knife. The two hospital security staff stood at the doorway, scanning the room like they were trying to identify the threat. Lynn made it easy for them. She stood with her hands loosely clasped, posture gentle, face calm, almost worried. The kind of worried that cameras love. The kind of worried that makes everyone else look unreasonable by comparison. Tu Tieu, on the other hand, was standing between Lynn and the bed. Her shoulders were tense, her eyes were sharp, and in Lynn's world, sharpness could be edited into aggression with a single cut. Mrs. Nghia's monitor beeped faster than it should. Her breathing was shallow. The IV line trembled slightly with each movement of her hand. Lynn tilted her head towards security, voice soft. "Thank you for coming. I'm concerned for her. She needs rest, but someone keeps upsetting her." Tu Tieu felt the cold spread through her chest. Lynn wasn't here to win with a signature anymore. She was here to win with a story. Tu Tieu forced her shoulders to drop. She loosened her hands, she softened her face. Not because she felt soft, but because she refused to become Lynn's proof. "There's no fight," Tu Tieu said evenly. "Mrs. Nghia is a patient. She was asked to sign a document that is not purely medical consent." One guard raised a hand, calm but firm. "We received a complaint about a disturbance. We need to ensure the patient is safe." "She is safe," Tu Tieu replied. "But she is being pressured." Lynn sighed as if she was exhausted by drama. "Tu Tieu, please. She's under stress. She's been through so much. Don't make it worse." Mrs. Nghia tried to speak, but her voice came out thin. I don't want to sign." Lynn stepped closer to the bed with practiced tenderness. "You're tired. Let me help. Just sign and rest." Tu Tieu moved one step, not toward Lynn, not aggressively, just enough to block. She said no. The guard's gaze dropped to the clipboard. "What's the paperwork?" Tu Tieu lifted the clipboard carefully and held it out. First page is medical, second page is not. The guards leaned in. One flipped the pages, frowning immediately. "This doesn't look like a standard hospital form," he muttered. Lynn's smile tightened, just a hair. "It's administrative. Sometimes hospitals attach authorizations to streamline urgent matters." Tu Tieu kept her tone flat. "Hospitals do not attach legal authorization for company control to a treatment consent." The guard looked from Tu Tieu to Lynn. "Ma'am, who are you?" "Family," Lynn answered smoothly. Mrs. Nghia's eyes widened and she forced a word out, stronger than her body looked capable of producing. "No." The room went still. Lynn's expression remained calm, but her eyes sharpened. "She's confused," Lynn said gently. "Medication can—" Mrs. Nghia shook her head weakly, tears gathering. "She is not my authorized family." Tu Tieu spoke quickly, respectful but firm. "Please call the attending physician, and please keep this visitor outside until the patient is stable." Lynn's voice cooled. "You can't order security." Tu Tieu met her gaze. "I'm not ordering. I'm protecting a patient who is being pressured to sign something she doesn't understand." The guard nodded to his partner. "Call the doctor." A nurse hurried in, eyes wide as she checked the monitor. "Her heart rate is high," she said. Tu Tieu immediately turned to Mrs. Nghia, lowering her voice. "Breathe slowly. In through your nose, out through your mouth. You're safe. You're not signing anything." Mrs. Nghia nodded faintly, trying. Lynn hovered near the bed like a shadow pretending to be light. "See?" she murmured to security, still calm. "Stress harms her. This isn't good for her recovery." Tu Tieu's jaw clenched. Lynn was blaming the rescue for the drowning. Then Lynn leaned in closer, voice dropping. Dangerous now, the sweetness gone. "If she doesn't sign," Lynn said, "the board votes without her, and they won't be gentle." Mrs. Nghia flinched as if Lynn had touched a bruise. Tu Tieu took a slow breath and kept her voice controlled. "Step back." Lynn's eyes flashed. "You're making a scene again." "You came here to create one," Tu Tieu said quietly. For a second, Lynn's calm mask slipped. There was irritation there, impatience, a flicker of anger. Then the mask returned. "I came here to help," she said smoothly. The door opened again. The doctor arrived, an older man with tired eyes, coat slightly wrinkled as if he'd been pulled from another emergency. He took one look at Mrs. Nghia's monitor and frowned. "What's happening?" he asked. Tu Tieu spoke first, voice steady and factual. "Doctor, she's under stress because someone is pressuring her to sign documents unrelated to her care. The attached page is not a medical form." Lynn immediately shifted into concern mode, her voice soft like cotton. "Doctor, I'm only trying to support her. She's overwhelmed. I'm worried about her decision-making." The doctor's eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" "Family," Lynn answered again. Mrs. Nghia forced herself to speak clearly. "She's not authorized." That was enough. The doctor turned to security. "Remove the visitor. Patient needs rest. No paperwork unless it comes directly through staff and me." Lynn's eyes widened a fraction, the first real surprise. Then she recovered quickly. "Doctor, she's confused. She's under medication." The doctor cut her off firm. "Remove her." Security stepped forward. Lynn didn't fight. She didn't need to. Fighting would ruin her image. Instead, she smiled sadly, as if she was the misunderstood one. "Of course," Lynn said softly. "I'll go. I only wanted to help." As she walked past Tu Tieu, her voice dropped so low only Tu Tieu could hear. "This was the easy part," Lynn whispered. "You can't protect her from the world." Tu Tieu didn't respond. She didn't chase. She didn't give Lynn even a single word to twist. Lynn left with slow, confident footsteps, heels clicking down the hallway like a countdown. The door closed. The room finally exhaled. The doctor adjusted medication and checked Mrs. Nghia's pulse. "No visitors for a while," he said, "and if any forms appear, staff verifies them directly with me." Tu Tieu nodded. "Thank you, doctor." When the doctor and security left, silence settled again, heavy, exhausted. Mrs. Nghia stared at the ceiling, voice shaking. "She came here to trap me." "Yes," Tu Tieu said gently. "She wanted you to sign, or she wanted you to look unstable. Either outcome helped her." Mrs. Nghia swallowed. "And the nurse? Was the nurse involved?" Tu Tieu's eyes tightened. "I don't know yet, but Lynn doesn't walk into a hospital room with a 2-page trap by accident." Mrs. Nghia's lips trembled. "I'm tired." "I know," Tu Tieu whispered, "but you did one strong thing today. You said no." Mrs. Nghia turned her head toward Tu Tieu. "Even if I said no, what if the board votes anyway?" Tu Tieu's expression hardened, but her voice stayed calm. "Then we hit first, tonight." She opened her phone and pulled up the extracted evidence again. The burner number chat, the templates, the instructions, the proof that the smear wasn't random. "This evidence proves coordination," Tu Tieu said. "It also proves the company was breached from inside. The board can't ignore sabotage and still claim they're protecting stability." Mrs. Nghia closed her eyes briefly. "They're afraid." "Yes," Tu Tieu agreed. "And Lynn feeds fear. That's why we starve it. With facts." A buzz hit Tu Tieu's phone. "Unknown number. Check the news." Tu Tieu's stomach dropped. She tapped the link. A blurry video clip was already circulating, short, shaky, dramatic. It showed the hallway outside the room. It showed raised voices, but not the words. It showed Tu Tieu standing between the bed and the doorway, and the caption, without naming anyone, suggested a patient was being disturbed. Tu Tieu's fingers tightened around the phone. The clip had been cut to remove the paperwork, cut to remove the doctor's order, cut to remove Lynn's pressure. Mrs. Nghia saw Tu Tieu's face change. "What is it?" Tu Tieu turned the phone slightly so she could see. Mrs. Nghia's breath caught. "She filmed it." "She planned it," Tu Tieu said, voice low. "She didn't need a signature, she wanted footage." Mrs. Nghia's eyes filled. "I can't survive another wave." Tu Tieu leaned closer, voice soft but fierce. "Then we don't wait for the wave. We drain the water before it reaches you." She called the board chairman immediately. He answered on the first ring, voice tense. We're drafting the statement now. Lynn just launched a hospital clip, Tu Tieu said. Edited, viral. She's painting this as disturbing a patient. The chairman swore under his breath. She's relentless. Then the statement needs to come out tonight, Tu Tieu said. Not tomorrow, and it has to be clean, factual, calm. It must say, internal sabotage identified, evidence preserved, legal action initiated, and patient privacy will be protected. The chairman hesitated. If we mention the hospital, we risk more attention. If you stay silent, the clip becomes the truth, Tu Tieu replied. Silence is what Lynn uses as a blank page. A pause. Understood, he said. We'll release it tonight. And lock down any staff who accessed patient forms, Tu Tieu added. This isn't just company sabotage now, it's hospital manipulation. The chairman exhaled. I'll coordinate with compliance and legal. Tu Tieu ended the call and turned to Mrs. Nghia. We're going to limit your exposure. No more visitors. No more forms unless verified by the doctor, and we prepare for the board vote. Mrs. Nghia whispered, What if the board still tries to replace me? Tu Tieu's eyes hardened. Then we show them the truth and remind them replacing you under sabotage pressure makes them complicit. Mrs. Nghia looked away, voice small. Uri will find out. He'll blame himself. Tu Tieu's chest tightened. He already saw partial headlines. He just can't reach us. As if the universe wanted to twist the knife, Tu Tieu's phone flickered with a weak signal notification, then vanished. Not enough to call Uri, not enough to send a full update. Mrs. Nghia's voice trembled. He's far away. Tu Tieu leaned closer and squeezed her hand carefully, avoiding the IV. When he gets signal, we'll give him something solid. Proof, not chaos. Mrs. Nghia nodded, eyes wet. Then the nurse returned with a clipboard again, this time holding it close, cautious. Just checking in, she said. The doctor asked me to confirm. No more paperwork today. Tu Tieu's gaze stayed sharp. Thank you. The nurse hesitated, then lowered her voice. Also, someone is still asking about Mrs. Nghia downstairs. She's dressed very well. Calm. She keeps smiling. Mrs. Nghyia's eyes widened in fear. Tu Tieu stood instantly. Tell security she's not allowed on this floor, not near this room. The nurse nodded and left quickly. The hallway outside went quiet again. Too quiet. Tu Tieu listened, every muscle alert. She could almost hear Lynn's confidence echoing in her head. You can't protect her from the world. Tu Tieu looked at Mrs. Nghia, pale, trapped in a hospital bed, fighting a war she never asked for. Then Tu Tieu's expression shifted. No panic, no rage, just focus. Lynn wants the hospital to become a stage, Tu Tieu said softly, so we're going to turn it into a courtroom. Mrs. Nghia swallowed. How? Tu Tieu lifted her phone, thumb hovering over the evidence folder. We package the proof. We send it to legal tonight. We force the board to stand behind you tomorrow, and we prepare for Lynn's next move because she didn't come here to visit. Mrs. Nghia's voice was barely a whisper. She came here to finish me. Tu Tieu's eyes burned with controlled determination. Then she chose the wrong room. Outside, down the corridor, footsteps echoed faintly again. Slow, unhurried, like someone still believed she owned the ending. And Tu Tieu realized the terrifying truth. Catching the insider had only cut one wire. Lynn had already lit another fuse, right here where Mrs. Nghia couldn't run, and now Tu Tieu had to stop the explosion before morning.